So you've got yourself a GMMK2 and you're loving it, but you watch like 100 keyboard videos and it's got you wondering, can my keyboard sound like that? Well, if you're expecting to get your keyboard to sound like a custom key cult, no, unfortunately. But the good news is that with a little bit of messing around, you can get this keyboard actually sounding pretty good. Glorious left a lot open for you to really get in there and tinker with. So let's go ahead and get started. The GMMK2 comes stock with Glorious's own Fox linear switch, and I was a big fan of these right out of the box. When talking about pre-built options specifically, I would take these over like a Cherry Red or a Gateron Red. They come factory lubed with, I'm assuming, Glorious's own G-Lube, but like any switch, factory lubed or not, these really benefit from time-consuming, tender, switch-by-switch lube jobs. Rather than subject myself to the time-consuming task that is cleaning factory lube switches, then reapplying lube, I opted to do a once-over with Glorious's G-Lube since I figured that's what they used anyway. And the result was pretty good. I ended up with a smoother, more deeper sounding switch that I was really happy with. I've never been a big fan of any of the speed switches or the low actuation point switches that are out there. And I feel like this is a really good middle ground. When looking at the GMMK2's stabilizers, they actually come with some pretty decent plate stabilizers. I was really surprised by these. These are pretty much stock Cherry plate mount stabilizers. So first things first, I went ahead and clipped those. This helps the stabilizer fit flush to the PCB and make less of a rattling noise. Now, these also come factory lubed. Factory lube can be pretty inconsistent. I've seen pretty good factory jobs from Novel Keys, but other than that, I generally don't trust it. If your stabilizers sounded as good as mine did out of the box, you may not feel the need to lube your stabilizers, but there's a chance over time they might end up needing a little loving. Not counting higher end PCB screw-in mount stabilizers, I found that plate mount stabilizers generally need a reapplication of lube every few months or so, especially on the spacebar. Should the plate stabilizers not be enough for you, you do have the option of upgrading to more premium screw-in stabilizers. Glorious recently released their GSV2 stabilizers, and they fit and feel great in this board. It's hard to say that I'm not partial to these, given just how they sound in general and like how they sound in my GMMK Pro, but it's tricky because the original plate stabilizers were pretty good. It is what it is. If you feel like you want to take on the challenge of replacing your stabilizers, go for it. If not, you can live with the fact that you have some of the best plate mount stabilizers that I've seen, with the exception of like maybe Ducky or Novel Keys. Now, in terms of other third-party screw-in stabilizers like Duroc or ZealPCs, like the GMMK Pro, I ran into issues here. ZealPC stabs seemed to fit okay, but I just couldn't get my Duroc stabs to fit. It felt like the housings were just slightly too thick. It feels like basically the same scenario you run into with the GMMK Pro. The difference there is that even with the stock aluminum plate, there's a lot more give with that plate, given that it's just a plate assembly and the housing is completely separate. But here, the plate is actually a part of the top housing, which makes it a lot more difficult to try and fit these in here. Now, I've seen a lot of people file down the aluminum plate on their GMMK Pro. I did this as well at the beginning, but I eventually made the hop to the polycarbonate plate anyway, and my Duroc stabilizers fit fine in there. Now, of course, it doesn't matter because I'm using the GSV2s anyway, but it's still something you should note. When it comes to the plate on the GMMK2, I wouldn't really recommend going the route of trying to file it down to get something like Duroc stabs to fit, because any scratch or any ding or any mistake you make on that plate is going to show up. Whereas with the GMMK Pro, most of your plate is hidden by the top housing. So if I was buying stabilizers for this, I would definitely stick to the GSV2s. I'm sure it's possible to get away with filing this down and leaving minimal marking, but it's just not something I'm willing to try since I don't really have to at this point. Or if you've had luck getting Duroc V2 stabilizers into your GMMK2 plate, please let me know and let me know how you did it. This would bother me a lot more if it was on something like a bare bones kit or a board that was specifically made to tinker with. But since it isn't, and Glorious actually offers pretty decent upgraded stabilizers now, my suggestion is if you want to go with the screw-in PCB mounted stabilizers, stick with the GSV2s. It's just easier. So you've lubed your switches, you got PCB mounted stabilizers in there, but it's missing something. If swapping out the stabs isn't enough for you, you can modify the sound profile of your board quite substantially by using what is known as the tape mod, which is basically just taking painter's tape and lining the back of your PCB with it. I have generally never been a fan of this mod, but I figured I would give it a shot here, and I was really impressed with the results. I opted to take out the bottom piece of foam that's in the case, and was really happy with the deep, thick sound I get out of this keyboard now. Personally, my final form was removing the bottom layer of foam and adding about 2 or 3 layers of painter's tape to the bottom of the PCB. It gave it that nice dense sound while still holding on to a bit of the reverb that you kind of lose when you go to like an all aluminum bottom, something like the GMMK Pro. For a long time now, Glorious's new products have released with updated software called Glorious Core. If you own any of the wireless variants of their mice or the GMMK Pro or the GMMK2, Glorious Core is the piece of software you want to be using. I think it's light years ahead of the original software, and it looks way better, and it's way more in tune with Glorious's overall aesthetic. One important note is that if you don't want to, you don't have to use their software. Glorious prides themselves in allowing you to get as much functionality out of your keyboard or mice as possible without using software, which can be a sticking point with other companies like Razer, requiring you to have login information and an always-on internet connection just to use your mouse. Once you've installed the software, you'll be met with a menu bar on the left that should show your keyboard right in the middle of the screen. If it doesn't, I always just disconnect and reconnect whatever peripheral it is, and then it pops up immediately. Clicking on your keyboard, you'll see the profile selector at the top left, and on the top right, you'll see options for lighting, keybinds, and performance. In the lighting tab on the right side, you'll see you have presets as well as per key RGB lighting. Glorious Core does not allow you to stack lighting effects on top of each other the way something like Synapse or IQ allows you to do, but it will allow you to add per key RGB on top of a default lighting mode. So if you wanted to use something like Glorious mode but have your WASD keys bright white, you could do that. Keybinds is pretty straightforward. It allows you to reassign keybinds to any key you want to. And the last tab, Performance, gives you the ability to adjust both your polling rate and your input latency. Do note that if you choose to change your input latency to 2 milliseconds, some users have reported key chatter or double key registers, although I've never had that problem. Now, if you really want to deep dive into keyboard software, you do have the option of installing a QMK firmware on this board, which is a little bit of a more in-depth topic that I'll probably tackle in another video. So yeah, that's it. The final form of my GMMK2 ended up being pretty similar to its original form. I just added a little bit of lube to the switches. I did add GSV2 stabilizers just because I had them on hand, but had I not had any, I don't think I would have updated them. Of course, I did the tape mod, which I had planned originally to revert back to its stock form, but given its deeper sound, I think I'm going to keep it like that, at least for the time being. And yeah, it's been living on my desk. I kind of alternate between that and my GMMK Pro, for whatever reason, whatever I'm feeling that day. So yeah, I'm looking forward to, the next keyboard we see from Glorious. I'm hoping some kind of a GMMK Pro 65%. I also saw recently that they announced that they're starting what they're calling Glorious Forge, which seems to be some kind of a small limited run, limited edition, starting with the pink Model O. Just why not wireless, man? Oh well, looks like I'm just going to have to call Bearded Bob and see if I can't figure out how to make the pink Model O wireless.